Captain Takashi Mori kept impeccable logs during his 32 years at sea, documenting weather patterns and navigational data with the precision of a man who understood that the ocean demands respect through detail, through the meticulous recording of every variable that might mean the difference between safe passage and catastrophe. He commanded the cargo vessel Hokushin Maru, a mid-sized freighter that ran regular routes between Yokohama and ports throughout Southeast Asia, carrying electronics and machinery on outbound journeys and returning with raw materials that fed Japan's manufacturing economy. His crew of 19 men were experienced sailors, many of whom had worked under his command for over a decade, men who knew the routines of maritime life and who performed their duties with the kind of efficiency that comes from repetition and mutual trust, built across countless voyages through calm seas and storms alike. On the night of September 23, 2017, in waters approximately 300 kilometers east of Okinawa, something rose from the depths that transformed these experienced sailors into men gripped by a terror so profound that by morning 5 of them would be dead, 3 would be catatonic and unresponsive to any external stimuli, and Captain Mori himself would be the sole survivor capable of providing a coherent account of what transpired during those 7 hours. When his ship became the stage for an encounter that maritime authorities would classify as collective hysteria brought on by methane gas exposure, despite physical evidence that suggested something far more disturbing, had visited the Hokushin Maru that night. The evening had begun unremarkably. The sea conditions rated as calm with swells measuring less than 2 meters. Visibility excellent under a 3/4 moon that painted the water in shades of silver and black. The kind of night that experienced sailors appreciate for its beauty, while remaining aware that the ocean's tranquility is always temporary, always conditional. Captain Mori was in his quarters reviewing the next day's route when the first anomaly appeared on the bridge equipment, a sonar contact that Chief Officer Yamada initially dismissed as a school of large fish, or possibly a whale pod moving beneath the ship at depths approaching 400 meters. The contact was massive, the acoustic signature suggesting something with a cross-section that exceeded 30 meters in diameter, and it was ascending, rising through the water column at a rate that Yamada found difficult to reconcile with any known marine life, approximately 15 meters per minute, steady and deliberate, approaching the surface with what could only be described as intention rather than the irregular ascent patterns typical of whales or other creatures that needed to breathe air. Captain Mori was summoned to the bridge at 2200 hours when the contact had risen to within 100 meters of the surface and showed no signs of deviating from its vertical trajectory. He arrived to find Yamada and the helmsman, a veteran named Tanaka who had served under Mori for 18 years, both staring at the sonar display with expressions that mixed professional concern with something less definable, something that looked uncomfortably like apprehension. The contact had stopped ascending, holding position at approximately 50 meters depth, directly beneath the ship's center point, pacing their speed exactly as if it were somehow tracking their movement, matching their course and velocity with a precision that suggested awareness, that suggested the Hokushin Maru was not simply passing over some random deep-sea creature, but was being deliberately followed by something that had chosen them specifically, that had singled out this particular vessel from all the others that traveled these waters, and decided to make contact in ways that the crew would soon understand were not accidental or benign. The thing that rose to the surface 20 minutes later was not a whale or any catalogued marine species, not a submarine or any human-made structure, but something that existed in the terrible space between biological organism and something else. Something that seemed to be constructed from the ocean itself, from water that had somehow achieved coherence and form without becoming solid. A column of darkness that was blacker than the surrounding sea, rising vertically from depths that should have been empty of anything but cold water and pressure, rising with the slow inevitability of something that had all the time in the world, because time under the ocean operates according to different rules, measured in geological epochs rather than human minutes and hours. The column was massive, easily 40 meters in height and perhaps 20 meters in diameter at its widest point, and it stood beside the Hokushin Maru like a pillar supporting an invisible ceiling, like a monument erected by forces that had no interest in human aesthetics or comfort, and on what might be called its surface, though surface suggested solidity that this thing did not possess. Shapes moved and reformed, patterns that might have been faces or might have been the random organization of water disturbed by currents that no one could explain, because there was no wind that night, no waves capable of generating the kind of motion that rippled across the column's exterior. The crew gathered on deck, summoned by shouts and the alarm that Yamada had activated, not because protocol demanded it, but because he needed other witnesses, needed confirmation that what he was seeing through the bridge windows was not hallucination or equipment malfunction, but something actually present in the physical world. 20 men stood at the starboard rail, and Captain Mori would later testify that in that moment, before the hysteria took hold, before the screaming began and the violence erupted among men who had been brothers in all but blood, there was absolute silence, a quiet so complete that he could hear the breathing of the sailor standing 3 meters away, could hear the metallic creak of the ship's hull as it responded to the presence of something that displaced water in ways that generated pressures and forces that the Hokushin Maru's designers had never anticipated or accounted for in their calculations. If you have ever experienced something at sea that defied explanation, something that made you question whether the boundaries between the known and unknown are as solid as we pretend they are, share your theories in the comments below. Because what happened next aboard the Hokushin Maru suggests that there are things in the ocean that affect human consciousness in ways we do not understand, that there are encounters which strip away the thin veneer of rationality we use to navigate daily life and reveal something more primitive beneath, something that our ancestors knew and feared and built their myths around, something that we, in our technological arrogance, have dismissed as superstition while forgetting that dismissal is not the same as disproof. The column began to change approximately 5 minutes after it fully surfaced, the shapes on its exterior becoming more defined, more clearly organized into patterns that resembled eyes and mouths. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, arranged in no symmetrical pattern, but distributed across the column's surface in ways that suggested they were not decorative or random, but functional, that each represented a point of perception, a location from which something was observing the ship and its crew, with an attention that felt not merely aware, but evaluative, judging, deciding. Engineer Sato was the first to break, screaming that the faces were his family, his wife and children, who had drowned 3 years earlier in a ferry accident, claiming he could hear them calling to him, begging him to join them in the water where they waited, where everything would be explained and forgiven, and he would finally understand why they had been taken from him. He climbed the rail before anyone could stop him, and he jumped, and the column did not simply allow him to fall into the water, but seemed to reach for him, tendrils of that impossible darkness extending and wrapping around his body mid-fall, pulling him not into the ocean but into itself, absorbing him through its surface, which parted like a membrane and then sealed again, leaving no trace that Sato had ever existed except for his screams, which continued for several seconds after he disappeared. Screams that seemed to come from inside the column itself, from multiple locations simultaneously, as if he had been distributed throughout its mass and was experiencing his dissolution from every point at once. The hysteria spread from that moment with the speed of a biological contagion. Men who had been rational and calm, suddenly overcome by compulsions that made them act against every survival instinct, against every bond of fellowship and professional duty. Two more sailors jumped within minutes, drawn by visions that only they could see, but which they described with such conviction and desperate longing that others began to edge toward the rail, began to lean over and reach toward the water, as if they too could perceive something beautiful and irresistible in the darkness below. Captain Mori ordered the helm to reverse engines, to put distance between the ship and the column. But Tanaka had abandoned his post, was on his knees on the deck, praying in a language that was not Japanese or any language Mori recognized. Words that sounded like they were being spoken backward, like recordings played in reverse. And when Mori tried to take the controls himself, he found that the ship would not respond, that the engines ran but generated no thrust, as if the Hokushin Maru was being held in place by forces that made physics irrelevant, by an attention that would not release them until it had satisfied whatever purpose had brought it to the surface on this particular night. The violence began when Chief Officer Yamada, who had been standing rigid and silent since the column appeared, suddenly turned and attacked the nearest crew member with a fire axe that he had retrieved from its mounting without anyone noticing, swinging the blade with strength that seemed impossible for a man of his slight build, connecting with the sailor's skull and killing him instantly, before turning on another and then another, moving with systematic efficiency through men who were too shocked or too paralyzed by their own visions to defend themselves. Captain Mori tackled Yamada after the third death, wrestling the axe away and restraining him with help from one of the few sailors who retained enough presence of mind to act. And when they looked into Yamada's eyes, they saw nothing that resembled the man they had known, saw only black that reflected no light, as if his eyes had become windows into the same darkness that constituted the column, as if something had entered him through his perception of it and was now operating his body, according to imperatives that had nothing to do with human motivation or human morality. The column began to descend as suddenly as it had appeared, sinking back into the depths without sound or disturbance, the water closing over it and leaving the sea surface as calm and undisturbed as if nothing had ever been there. But the effects on the crew did not immediately cease, the hysteria continuing for hours after the column disappeared, men screaming at visions that would not fade, attacking each other or themselves with whatever implements they could find, creating carnage that transformed the deck of the Hokushin Maru into a scene that Coast Guard investigators would later compare to battlefield conditions, blood and bodies scattered across steel surfaces that had been scrubbed and maintained with pride for decades, but which would never be truly clean again, never be free of the stains that marked where rationality had failed and madness had taken control. Captain Mori locked himself in the bridge with the three sailors who seemed least affected, barricading the door against the others, who pounded and clawed and demanded entry in voices that no longer sounded entirely human, that carried harmonics and resonances that human vocal cords should not produce. He sent a distress signal that was received by Coast Guard stations, but which triggered response protocols delayed by disbelief, by the suspicion that the transmission was a hoax, or that Captain Mori himself had suffered some kind of breakdown, because the contents of his message, describing a column of sentient water and a crew driven mad by contact with it, did not fit into any established category of maritime emergency. Rescue arrived at dawn, helicopters and patrol boats finding the Hokushin Maru adrift with engines silent and 5 bodies on deck, 3 men catatonic and unresponsive in the mess hall, Yamada restrained but conscious and speaking continuously in that reversed language, and Captain Mori on the bridge, coherent but changed in ways that medical examinations would document but never explain, his eyes showing the same light-absorbing quality that Yamada's displayed, though in lesser degree, as if he had been touched by the same force, but had somehow resisted its complete colonization of his consciousness. If this account disturbs you, if it suggests that there are things in the ocean that can affect human minds through mechanisms we do not understand, then you must help keep channels like this alive, must engage with this content so that testimonies like Captain Mori's reach the audiences who need to hear them, who need to understand that the ocean is not empty water waiting to be traversed, but territory inhabited by entities whose existence predates human civilization and whose purposes remain utterly alien to our frameworks of understanding. Subscribe, share this account. Not for entertainment, but for warning. Because what happened to the Hokushin Maru is not isolated, is part of a pattern that maritime authorities work to suppress through classifications like collective hysteria, through explanations that invoke gas leaks or mass psychology, or anything that fits within acceptable parameters of reality, while ignoring evidence that those parameters are insufficient, that they exclude too much, that they protect our comfort at the expense of truth. Stay warned about what really lives beneath the surface, because that warning may be the only protection available when you find yourself in waters where something decides to rise, where something chooses to make contact, where the boundary between the world you know and the world that exists in the deep places becomes permeable, and you are forced to confront the fact that consciousness is not limited to forms that evolution produced on land, that intelligence can emerge in environments we consider hostile to life, and that those intelligences have their own imperatives, their own methods of interaction, and absolutely no obligation to respect or preserve the sanity of the humans they encounter. Captain Mori spent 6 months in psychiatric evaluation, his testimony recorded and filed and ultimately dismissed as trauma-induced delusion despite the physical evidence, despite the deaths and the inexplicable silence that had affected the Hokushin Maru's engines, despite Yamada, who continued speaking that reverse language until he died suddenly 3 weeks after rescue. His autopsy revealing nothing abnormal except for brain tissue that showed patterns of electrical activity continuing for several minutes after death, as if something in him refused to accept that consciousness should cease with the termination of metabolic processes. Captain Mori was eventually released, deemed no longer a danger to himself or others, but he never returned to sea, would not even visit coastlines. Moved inland to mountains where the only water came from streams that were shallow and clear and contained nothing that could rise from depths beyond human comprehension. He died in 2021 at the age of 68, and his final words to the hospice nurse were reported as, "I can still see it, even here, even now," followed by something in that reversed language that the nurse could not reproduce, but which she said made her feel like her heart was beating backward, like time itself was moving in the wrong direction. His death certificate listed natural causes, cardiac arrest, but those who knew his story understood that he had been dying since that September night, when something rose beside his ship and showed him truths that human consciousness was not designed to accommodate. Truths about the nature of the ocean and what inhabits it. Truths that the UMIBŌZU of Japanese folklore was not invention, but imperfect description. Cultural memory of encounters with something that has always been there, waiting in the deep, occasionally rising to remind us that the surface world where we build our ships and our certainties is not the whole of reality, is merely the thin film of light atop darkness that extends for kilometers down into pressures and cold, where things that should not exist, continue to watch, continue to rise when they choose, leaving behind survivors who carry their truth like a curse, who spend the rest of their lives trying to warn anyone who will listen that the ocean is not dead water, but living territory, and what lives there does not think like us, does not value what we value, and has absolutely no interest in our categories of possible and impossible, real and unreal, sane and mad.